Well, here we are, the long-awaited episode 59 covering most of April 1990. Perhaps the biggest episode of Chrontendo ever. And by biggest, I mean in terms of length, not in the quality or the importance of the games. No, we really got a lot of stinkers today, but most of the games are interesting in at least weird ways. Episode 59 is anchored by 3 big games, all of which are fairly popular, and which I mostly dislike. And for whatever reason, I became more ambitious than normal, so the scope of this episode just kept increasing and increasing. A lot of footage was created for this video. The audio and unedited video came out to like over 300 gigabytes. So anyway, sorry if this episode is just too darn long, but let's get started. Our final game from March 1990 before we move on to April.
Nice shot.
Chronturbo fans will recognize this one as Jack Nicklaus's greatest 18 holes of major championship golf. Featuring Jack Nicklaus, the legendary golfer and a great connoisseur of holes. This began life as a 1988 computer game published by Accolade and developed by Sculptured Software. And this was a US-only release, published by Konami for some reason. Now on the surface, this is a pretty standard-looking golf game, but it does have some eccentricities. You have a few different gameplay options, for example, skins, in which you win money for each hole you play. Or you can also just play normal golf. You can choose between live players and computer players. However, there are a number of things that appear to be missing from the NES port that were found in the other versions, like the ability to play a particular hole, which I'm sure would not make Mr. Nicklaus happy because, you know, this guy is all about the holes. Obviously, this is a pretty ugly game. These textures are not exactly great. The screen is kind of shrunk down with these wide black borders on all sides. It's a bit of a step down from the TurboGrafx version. This might be a good opportunity to compare the power of the NES to that of the newer console. The background loads up nice and smooth. This looks a lot like the original computer version of the game. The colors are nicer, there's just more detail in the landscape. The NES version has all these blocky textures, and poor Jack himself just looks awful. Also, the handling feels a little weird in this version. The PC Engine game was pretty intuitive, but the NES version, well, I mean, trying to adjust for the wind gave me a lot of problems. Like here, the wind kept pushing my drives to the right. I kept aiming further and further to the left, and then I get a ball go way to the left, like there was no wind at all. The PC Engine game just feels more natural somehow. This is not exactly terrible, but the PC Engine version is simply better all around. April is here, and we begin with the first in a punishingly long list of JRPGs released in that month. First up is Deep Dungeon 4 from Hummingbird Soft, the fourth game in the Deep Dungeon series, and I don't want to break anyone's heart out there, but this is also the last Deep Dungeon game. I know there's a lot of Deep Dungeon fanatics out there, and maybe you'll stop watching Chrontendo now that the Deep Dungeon content has dried up. If so, well, I wish you well. Anyway, we are blessed with an English translation of this. There actually is a little bit of a story in the game, and right away we will notice the lack of dungeons here. We're actually wandering around in a town of some sort. The Deep Dungeon games are often referred to as wizardry clones, but by this point the series is kind of converted more to like a Bard's Tale inspired game. There are multiple villages, NPCs, forests, the whole 9 yards. Since we're wrapping up the Deep Dungeon series, let's take a quick look back at how the series started, all the way back to 1986, which feels like a million years ago. The first Deep Dungeon game was released for the Famicom Disk System. It was the most basic dungeon crawler imaginable. You wandered around in a nondescript neon green dungeon looking for loot and fighting bog standard RPG monsters. Each new game in the series changed the formula a bit, and by Deep Dungeon 3 you actually have multiple party members and character classes. The game also gives you gold for defeating monsters, unlike the other games in the series in which monsters only drop loot that you then need to sell. Deep Dungeon 4 simplifies a lot of the game's mechanics. You are back down to one character and there's no longer any sort of classes. Your character is totally non-customizable. Your stats and magic automatically improve when you level up, just like in the Dragon Quest games. Just like a lot of Western-style RPGs of this era, there is a high likelihood of getting just totally stomped in battle, due to the extremely random amount of damage dealt. Like here, I encountered some goblins and a hobgoblin very early in the game. I was doing okay, I killed off 2 goblins, healed a couple times, and then blam, a goblin killed me in one blow. There is a bit of a plot in this game, and there are quite a few NPCs that you need to talk to. This guy gives you a mission to fix the water supply. You need to stomp around in this forest until you find a dragon who's stuck in the reservoir or something. One thing to note, the maps are pretty large and very easy to get lost in, and there's not like a whole lot of distinguishing features in the terrain, so this is very clearly intended to have the player draw out maps by hand while exploring. And there are actual dungeons in here as well. So if you're looking for an RPG that feels like a very simplified version of Bard's Tale or Might and Magic, then I guess you could hypothetically play this. Okay, next up we have another RPG. Oh lord, here we go. RPG number 2. Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei 2, published by Namco and developed by Atlus. This is of course a somewhat belated sequel to the first Megami Tensei game, released in 1987. We'll be looking at a partial translation for this game, which will make it somewhat easier to play this thing. Still, the experience is going to be less than optimal. I dig the ominous music here. The game starts you off with a rather strange warning, then takes you to a character selection screen, and here you put points into various attributes. Once you're done, the game starts and wow, you look like a total dork. A bit of exploration reveals some NPCs that will save your game or sell you items. You are told you will need to kill Taurus, or the Minotaur, as we would normally call him. Another NPC will inform you that you're in Daedalus Tower. And in fact, this beginning dungeon is a very accurate recreation of the Daedalus Tower area from the first Megami Tensei game. Though that game, of course, used a first-person perspective, and this one uses a top-down perspective. So after buying some equipment, you head on down one floor and begin exploring the dungeon, where you'll encounter some entry-level Megami Tensei monsters such as the slime and the pixie. However, I was unfortunate to immediately encounter 5 Will-o'-the-Wisps, and poor Susie got killed. This means I had to trek back up to the top floor to heal and revive her. Now this guy here is also where you go to fuse demons together. For those familiar with the Megami Tensei games, you'll know that collecting and breeding demons is a major part of the game. In battle, you can choose to talk to demons rather than fighting them. There are various tactics that you can try, like being friendly or trying to coerce them to join you. Sometimes this works, and sometimes it doesn't. Now once you have some demons in your party, you can summon them during a fight. And you can give them to this guy to fuse. Doing so will sort of smash the demons together into a third demon, which is usually more powerful than the parent demons. Demons can cast spells, so creating new demons will allow you to access some very helpful spells, both offensive and defensive. So once you've leveled up enough and you have a couple strong demons on your team, it's time to fight the Minotaur, who is a bit scrawnier than expected. Now the reason you're fighting him is to get your hands on this orb he has. Once you've taken care of him, you need to give this orb to a statue in another part of the dungeon, and then a plot twist. You see, it turns out that everything in the game so far has been a video game you are playing. I mean, not you, the person, but you, the character in the video game. Though this is something that would have been revealed earlier if you had died in the Daedalus Tower. Anywho, it turns out that beating the game frees someone named Pazuzu. You might remember him from the Exorcist movie, and you are granted the ability to summon demons in real life. In this case, real life is post-apocalyptic Tokyo. This is some sort of like futuristic shelter that is safe from all the demons roaming around. You have your typical shops and NPCs hanging around, and unfortunately there are gangs of punks that will attack you, and also there are zombies for some reason. And unfortunately for me, my very first battle in Tokyo, I got jumped by 4 punks and they completely wiped my party out. In addition to money and experience, you also get magnetite, which is used whenever you summon a demon. Not having enough magnetite will also cause your demons to lose health. Now there are going to be some difficulties in playing this game. There's a lot of text, and this translation is nowhere near complete. As of the time of making this video, a brand new full translation is either completed or very close to complete, but has not yet been released. So I'm sort of in the same situation I was when I did the first game. A translation came out like right after that episode was released. At the moment, the best way to play this game might actually be to skip this and instead go for the fully translated Super Nintendo remake. There's been some rebalancing and game improvements done. But, you know, I really don't like the way this version looks. It's been redone to look like the Shin Megami Tensei games, and it feels like blander to me. The demons kind of lack the character of those in the NES version. So a few other things about this. The music is really great for one. Namco used some fancy memory mapper chip that allowed for additional sound channels. Megami Tensei 2 is sort of the game where the series kind of like actually starts, like, you know, what you and I think of when we think of Megami Tensei. It drops any connection to the original novel, and the main Megami Tensei series of games is based on this game rather than the 1987 game. So many characters, mechanics, and ideas in later games came from Megami Tensei 2. Even Jack Frost makes his first appearance here. The game is well known for having multiple endings, including the rather infamous one where you fight Yahweh as the final boss. On the other hand, this game can be tedious, frustrating, and unbalanced. But if you are interested, keep an eye out for the upcoming translation and check it out. One of the 3 big games this episode, we have Ninja Gaiden 2, Dark Sword of Chaos. Released in April in Japan as Ninja Ryuukenden 2. An English version hit the US very quickly in May. Let's start by pointing out this fantastic opening, with its pseudo-parallax scrolling, and with what looks like multiple layers of clouds and mountains, as well as the character in the foreground. Now, Ninja Gaiden is one of the most cinematic video games made, by which I mean the game's story is laid out in many long cutscenes. And these cutscenes are very talky. And outside of these cutscenes, virtually nothing happens that advances the game's story. As you might recall, in the first Ninja Gaiden game, Ryu defeated Jackie O, and now Jackie O's boss, Ashtar, is plotting something. Ashtar is one of those villains who just stands around brooding and going, yes, everything is going according to plan, right up to the point where they get their asses handed to them. CIA agent Irene, who Ryu has the hots for, reappears in this game. So anyway, 1 year later, Ryu is still hanging out in New York City. The handling of Ryu is a little different here than in the first game. The A and B buttons are still for attacking and jumping, and of course ninja magic reappears as well. And this time all the power-ups and such are contained in these floating red spheres. In the original game you had to break candles or lamps on the walls to get power-ups, so there was a bit more of a Castlevania vibe when it came to collecting power-ups in the first game. The timing when it comes to hitting the spheres with your sword is actually pretty finicky and takes a while before it becomes second nature. Now there is one new and very helpful ninja magic power you can get, a duplicate or shadow ninja that follows you around at a slight delay. The manual awkwardly calls this power quote-unquote splitting your body. The great thing about the shadow ninja is it's capable of attacking but cannot take damage itself. Learning to effectively use the Shadow Ninja is enormously helpful, and it's also something I never really got very good at while playing this. The first boss, Dando the Cursed, is far and away the easiest. You just attack and then jump on a wall when he charges at you. After each boss battle you'll get a cutscene, and there are many cutscenes in this game. Here you're first introduced to Robert, a sleeveless blonde special forces dude who, unlike Ryu, seems to know what the hell is going on. It's actually kind of funny how clueless Ryu is in this game. He has to have literally everything explained to him by the other characters. Second stage begins with a short train ride to the mountains. Such favorite enemies such as the eagle reappear, and you then ascend the mountain in a snowstorm. And here the game deploys a rather clever gimmick. The wind pushes you back while blowing against you, or pushes you forward if it's blowing in the direction that you're moving. So you need to factor in the wind when jumping across these chasms. If you jump against the wind, you'll not be able to jump far enough and will fall to your death. Another thing, Ninja Gaiden 2 has a timer, and the timer is actually kind of brutal. You really cannot dick around in this game. While fighting the second boss, Baron Spider, whose backstory in the manual is almost identical to Spider-Man's, when fighting him I came within 3 seconds of running out of time. Now, to be honest, I had never played past level 2 before playing this for Chrontendo, and I was actually getting a bit tired of the wind bit in this level, and I was thinking, okay, at least I'm past that gimmick level. However, it turns out the joke was on me. Ninja Gaiden 2 is full of gimmick levels. So, level 3 is the lightning level, meaning that the level is pitch black except for when lightning flashes. And the weird thing is, it looks like these stone walls are just like sitting on the ground, so that if you fell off one, you would just land on the ground and need to climb back up. But nope, you will in fact fall into a bottomless pit and die if you fall off one of the walls. Each level in Ninja Gaiden is broken into several areas. Luckily, the timer resets in each new area, and if you die, you'll restart in the same area you died in. Thankfully, this part of the level ditches the lightning thing, but it still has plenty of opportunities to fall to your death. Boss number 3 is a robot named, well, according to the manual, he's named Funky Dynamite. And his various projectiles can be a huge pain unless he just happens to position himself where his rockets will pass over your head, and you can hit him while jumping up and down. So you've rescued Irene from Funky Dynamite, and then Ashtar turns up and makes fun of you. At this point, the cutscenes start getting longer and longer, and more dialogue heavy, and there's often a long cutscene at the end of a level, and then another cutscene at the start of the next level. Robert shows up again, shoots Ashtar, and then tells him the whole area is surrounded. So Ashtar takes off with Irene. Robert again has to explain what's going on to Ryu and tells him to follow Ashtar into the underground maze. The underground level, despite being decked out with fiery pits everywhere, is not that bad at first. Now, one thing that really bugged me about Heavy Barrel from a couple episodes ago was the blind power-ups. It's far too easy to downgrade your weapons by opening up the chests. You can get a weaker weapon than you already have. And the same thing is true here. Many times you will find that it's going to be very difficult to slash a power-up sphere with your sword without actually collecting the power-up, meaning that you might unintentionally get a less useful ninja magic. In Castlevania, you can generally break open candles from a distance, so you can see what sub-weapon it contains before you pick it up, but in Ninja Gaiden that's often not the case. On the other hand, many spheres contain life bar and magic bar extensions and refills, and these are vital to beating the game, so you really have to slash open as many power-up spheres as you can. Also, the game has quite a few spheres in like out-of-the-way places, and getting to them can waste valuable time. Remember, you have to start all the way from the beginning of an area if the timer runs out. So a certain amount of memorization is required to know which spheres to collect and which to avoid. Now this area is just annoying as hell. The water keeps continuously pushing you backward, and there's tons of opportunities to fall off ledges. In this boss battle, these weird giant claws come out to attack you, but you actually need to attack the completely stationary head up at the top. And again, there's all this flowing water that will push you off the ledges to your death if you're not careful. Alright, after this, Ashtar taunts you a bit more, and you continue through the underground world. This part has lots of spikes and fire, and you might be hoping that the gimmick levels are over, but then we get to an ice area. And in games like Avoid the Noid, ice levels are obnoxious, but in Ninja Gaiden, they are just plain sadistic. Finally, it's time to square off against Ashtar and rescue Irene. But Ashtar, the big jerk, decides to stab her with the titular dark sword. And, oh, this part looks kinda dirty. Naturally, Robert shows up again and points his Glock at Ashtar, and then we finally get the big showdown between Ryu and Ashtar. Pretty much all the battles are much easier with the Shadow Ninja duplicates, since they allow you to damage a boss while standing out of harm's way. Okay, so you've defeated Ashtar, but he's not really defeated. He's still going to call the powers of darkness to destroy the world or whatever. And Irene is looking pretty healthy for someone who just got impaled on a giant demon sword. At this point, the game switches it up a bit with a very short post-boss area, leading to this impressive reveal of Ashtar's castle. And then we get a short cutscene where Irene and Robert run into this mysterious figure. Boy, who could this possibly be? Now the run up to the castle is pretty straightforward. No gimmicks, but it's still packed with tons of annoying enemies. I mean, if you've played Ninja Gaiden 1, you kind of know how this game operates. Multiple enemies will attack you at once, often pushing you back, causing you to hit other enemies. The game, as I mentioned, is pretty damn sadistic. Now this boss right here drove me crazy. There's two of these guys, but only one can be damaged. Those of you with good memories will recognize these guys from the first Ninja Gaiden game. They were the boss of the 4th level. Okay, so we now get more cutscenes, and at this point Robert shows up yet again and lets you know that Irene had been kidnapped again. She spends pretty much the whole game kidnapped. And I almost feel that maybe Robert would be better suited to this job than Ryu. Despite being a normal human being without magic powers, he seems to have no problem dealing with hordes of monsters and manages several times to sneak up on Ryu, who is, a ninja, mind you. Oh good, we are finally at the 7th and last level, which is just non-stop Ninja Gaiden style bullshit. Just throwing tons of fast enemies at you, and honestly, I was ready for the game to be over at this point. A number of people feel this is easier than the first game, and yeah, they did change some things, like for example Ryu's climbing ability, You can just climb up walls now without having to like jump back and forth from one wall to the other. And if you die during the final level, they don't send you all the way back to the beginning of that level. But despite these changes, I still found this game to be like, I don't know, absolutely exhausting. Anyway, the final boss is Jackie-O, who is alive for some reason, and now he's got the dark power of evil. The final boss battle is a 3-parter. Oh boy. First, he appears in his form from the first game. He flies around and you stab him or use your ninja magic on him. However, you don't get any health or magic refills, so you're going to have to play a bit cleaner than I did here. Trust me, I was not going for a perfect run in this game. I was just trying to get to the end any way I could. Okay, so here's another cutscene. And damn, that's a lot of blood. How did this thing get a Nintendo seal of quality? The blood awakens the sword. Irene gets electrocuted. Jackie-O comes back to life, and Ryo remains very confused. The second boss is just a scary head that you've got to attack while he coughs up meatballs, and some kind of icky fluid oozes down from a number of ceiling orifices. This game is actually a little gross. Then, Ryu's sword becomes infused with power, and we are finally at the final part of our battle with Jackie-O. You must stab his face while avoiding his hands and the stuff that he spits at you. Then you can focus on this relatively defenseless body part right here. And honestly, are we attacking his balls? Now that the evil forces have been defeated, we see the evil castle. I'm not sure if this is Ashtar's castle or Jackie-O's castle, but Ryu is sad because his girlfriend is dead. And honestly, I mean, does he even really know her that well? I mean, they hung out a bit in the first game, but were they ever, like, officially even dating? Either way, Ryu's sword brings her back to life and we get a happy ending. In a lot of ways, Ninja Gaiden 2 is a major accomplishment. Its use of cutscenes was pretty much unprecedented in scope for an NES game. On the other hand, the cutscenes have almost nothing to connect them to the actual game. It's like the story stops after each cutscene. Ryu then runs through a gauntlet of enemies who never appear in the cutscenes, and then we get more cutscenes in which the plot is moved along by Ryu and Ashtar yakking at each other. Another thing that bugs me is how weirdly random the normal enemies are. A typical level will contain mundane animals like bats, eagles, giant spiders, but also various demon-like creatures, not to mention Jason from the Friday the 13th movies, camouflage-wearing army guys, and a number of weird things that I can't really tell what they are. It almost feels like a bunch of rejected enemies from other games were all kind of like tossed into this one. On paper, this game seems very cool. I mean, the music is great, the visual design is excellent, it has so many great textures. Most of the bosses are like these huge multi-sprite behemoths, yet I just hated playing this thing. I mean, it felt like a chore to me. I understand a lot of people love this game, but for me, I don't know. After this, of course, Tecmo would release Ninja Gaiden 3, and then a few handhold games and a Master System game, but the series otherwise was ignored by Tecmo for an entire decade. Until Ninja Gaiden for the Xbox came along, which, might really be the only Ninja Gaiden game that I actually like. So let's continue on through April with some less memorable games. Here's an odd one, Ultraman Club 2 from Bandai, developed by a short-lived company called Interlink. Now there's really nothing weird about the game itself, it's a pretty standard licensed game from a very prolific publisher. Just like the last Bandai game we covered, the Akuma-kun game, it is a quickie RPG cash-in title. Rather, the odd thing about it is its place in video game history, as the first credit for a well-known figure in the game industry. So your first impression is probably going to be that this looks really trashy. This is a pre-credits prologue in which Ultraman fights some monster dudes and gets knocked out. He awakens in one of those standard RPG first villages, except that there's even less to do than there are in most RPG first villages. Basically, you can talk to the villagers and that's it. Now as far as RPGs go, Ultraman Club 2 is pretty stripped down. There's no armor, weapons, or even items to buy. It's clearly aimed at a younger audience, and the game is relatively short. That doesn't mean it's easy though. I got murdered by the second encounter and I had to restart back at the village. game will sometimes throw way too many enemies at you, and it certainly doesn't feel balanced. Your first objective is to make it to the Ultraman base. Now, there were many Ultraman TV shows and movies and such, and this game sort of like brings together characters from all those different series. Ultraman was kind of like Shazam. It just started as just one guy, and a few years later down the road there's like a whole army of them. The idea of bringing together different variations of one character is still pretty popular. For example, that Spider-Man animated movie that came out a few years ago. The first Ultraman Club game hit shelves way back in 1987, right around the same time that Zelda 2 and Dragon Quest II were released. It was actually a Famicom Disk System game. That's how old it was. No idea why Bandai suddenly decided to revive it after such a long time. So like I was saying, Ultraman is an RPG that's just stripped down to the bare bones. You don't really have items or magic or healing potions, but there are a few things that take their place. In battle, you can sometimes use special attacks. These appear to be completely random. They just show up in the menu sometimes. They actually appear pretty frequently, so you should be able to use at least several of them in a typical battle. Later in the game, you will get capsules that contain friendly monsters that can be used in battle. Certain capsule monsters will fight for you. Others will function much like normal RPG spells, such as healing the party, warping you out of a dungeon, or so on. For the first part of the game, however, you'll need to return to the base in order to heal, and you'll probably have to do this quite a lot. Now, I mentioned earlier that a prominent individual in the gaming world was involved in this game. Ultraman Club 2 is in fact the first video game credit for Kenji Ino, who would later, in 1990, found his own development company, EIM, and release a few Famicom games. Later in the decade, he would become a notable figure in both the US and Japan for such titles as Enemy Zero and the 2D games. In the 2000s, he focused more on mobile games before dying of a heart attack at the age of 42. If nothing else, Ultraman Club 2 earns a place as a footnote in the history of video games. So, this game is insanely grindy at first. Before you can even think of entering the first dungeon, you better spend a lot of time flying around building up several levels. And remember, you've got to be tough enough to make it through the dungeon and beat the first boss without the ability to heal. You need to land on this little island shaped like eyeglasses, which is actually called Eyeglass Island apparently, and then you have to make your way through this extremely ugly dungeon. It makes sense to run from every battle if possible. You'll probably have around 40 some hit points, and while most enemies do small amounts of damage, every so often one will use a special attack and take off like 10 hit points or so. And the encounter rate is extremely high here. It feels like every 3 steps you'll be in a fight. I was down to about 30 hit points when I finally reached the boss. Luckily, I was able to take him down in about 4 rounds. At this point, you will have rescued Ultraman Ace, who just happens to have some capsules on him, which is good news. As I mentioned earlier, these are basically one-use magic spells, so you can use a capsule to warp you out of the dungeon. There's not really much else going on here except to take a trip to a nearby village and discover an underground passage which will lead you to another boss battle against this guy. after you waste him, his body is seen just lying on the floor, which is actually pretty unusual for an NES RPG. The plot thickens a bit here as you find a bunch of UFOs in the basement. Ultraman Ace gets captured again. Which will lead you to the game's second area, the moon. There's a total of 5 areas in this game, and it takes around 5 hours to complete, which in my opinion is just way too much time to spend on this game. I'm sure there are probably worse kiddie RPGs in the system, but even if you like really obscure Famicom RPGs, I would not bother with this one. Alright, here's a piece of junk that no one knows or cares about. Gunhed Aratanaru Tatakai from Bari. Does the name Vari ring a bell? Probably not. We've seen a few Vari games in Chrontendo, but I doubt you can remember a single one of them. Gunhed Aratanaru Tatakai is a tile-based strategy game adapted from Toho's 1989 live-action sci-fi movie, Gunhed. It's about a big robot named Gunhed, or Gun Unit Heavy Elimination Device. Despite this game being totally obscure, someone did produce an unofficial English translation, which makes it a bit easier to play, but it still doesn't make much sense to me. Before we go any further, let's state the obvious. This is the second Gunhed game, the first being, of course, the TurboGrafx-16 title known as Blazing Lasers in the US. This compile-developed game was one of the greatest console shoot-em-ups of the late 80s, and of course I'd much rather be playing Blazing Lasers instead of Gunhed Aratanaru Tatakai. If you want to see more Blazing Lasers, check out Chronturbo Episode 4. Gunhed the movie was apparently a pretty huge flop, so it's no surprise that this game has fallen into extreme obscurity, and for good reason. I'm sure you've noticed the music. Once the game itself starts, the music is a bit better and the graphics are functional, I suppose. You start off with a few robots and place them at various points on the island. The enemy or the other player does the same. Then you stomp around the island collecting parts and fighting enemy robots if you wish. The various parts you pick up appear to be the key to this game, as they can improve your robots and build new robots. Fighting can be done manually or automatically, or partially automatic. The robots all seem to have different weapons and abilities, and I got just destroyed in every single battle. On the island, you'll also find various buildings that refill your energy when you visit them. The main goal here appears to be to build new robots until you have a robot army capable of defeating the enemy. though when I played this game the enemy was much more successful at this than I was. But if you keep marching around the island, you'll find lots of spare robot legs and arms and stuff. Supposedly the best strategy is simply to try to avoid the enemy while building up your stock of robots. Apparently the enemy robots will start to run out of gas at some point, and then you can easily begin picking off the opposing forces. I didn't get very far into this, but it looks like the game ends with this boss battle based on this one playthrough I found online, and apparently takes around an hour or so to beat. As I mentioned earlier, this game is obscure. There's no English guides online, and on Nico I found exactly one video of someone playing this thing for more than a few minutes. Everything else is just brief samples of the game, music, and such. Alright, so we've got our super obscure game out of the way today. Let's move on to something else. Well, we've got 2 Konami games this episode, and while the Jack Nicklaus game wasn't that hot, I have to inform you that this one, Quarth, isn't really a big deal either. So Quarth is a barely remembered actiony puzzly game. Unlike Tetris, the single-player mode isn't particularly addictive, and the various 2-player options are really the way to go. One thing, however, you can choose which level you start on. The first level is the easiest. So the concept behind Quarth seems pretty clear. Someone at Konami remembered that Space Invaders was a very popular game, and Tetris was also a very popular game, so why not somehow combine them into one game? Just like Space Invaders, the enemy slowly marches down the screen towards you. If they reach that dotted line above your ship, you'll die. So you must blast away relentlessly. But instead of firing lasers, you shoot blocks in order to fill up the gap so that a perfect rectangle is formed. Once this happens, all the blocks that make up the rectangle disappear. Now, I'm not really sure I'm doing this correctly. To maximize your points, you need to rack up combos. That is, if you plan a bit more carefully, you can take out a series of contiguous rectangles at once. You don't have to fill in all the holes in the middle of the rectangle as long as the entire perimeter is filled in. But honestly, I mostly failed to do this because I'm just not a very good strategist when it comes to this game. I did not study Tetris knockoffs at West Point. I'm not exactly the Napoleon of filling in rectangles. And honestly, this game does get pretty hard. Each level is a little faster than the next, and by the final level you'll need to be like super fast and precise when it comes to laying down the blocks. Quarth originated in arcades in fall 1989, so Konami must have really hustled this onto consoles. In the US, it was released in arcades as Block Hole. A somewhat more dramatic intro is seen here compared to the Famicom version. The thing didn't really make much of a splash in the US, but it was apparently a pretty decent hit for Konami in Japan and Europe. About a month before this, Quarth was released in Japan on the Game Boy, and if you've heard of Quarth at all, it's probably because of this being released in 1990 in the United States. I don't believe it was really that big of a seller, but I'm sure it scratched that Tetris-like itch for some people. Quarth appears to be still somewhat remembered in Japan even today. There was a port for the MXS2 that was released on the Wii and the Wii U in Japan, and the game is now even available on the Switch. There is really nothing wrong with Quarth, it just feels kind of like a Bush League version of Tetris. April 13th of 1990 is a somewhat cursed day. Aside from Gunhed and Quarth, we have this very unusual item from SNK. Godslayer, Haruka Tenku no Sonata. Now don't get too excited. Unlike Megami Tensei 2, this is not one of those JRPGs where you fight God. I have no idea what the title is actually referring to. However, you and I know this game as Crystalis, released 3 months later in the US. So according to this game's intro, due to lightning strikes, the world ends a mere 7 years after this game was released. Apparently folks in 1997 were very technologically advanced, since they responded to this nuclear war or whatever by building a giant floating tower that will wipe out all evil. Now, the game itself takes place in 2097, and the war caused lots of fantasy-style monsters to appear, and society now exists in the form of various small villages whose predominant forms of commerce are inns, armor and weapon shops, and occasionally bars. One might say the world has been JRPG-ified. Now, the manual, on the other hand, tells a slightly different story. The tower, which contains a powerful computer, was created by an evil wizard named Dragon, who also hid these 4 magical swords around the world so they couldn't be used against him. And then 4 good wizards learned of a powerful wizard who was frozen in a cave, and then woke him up so that he could defeat Dragon. And that wizard is you. So you wake up with no memory apparently and wander around the opening village. The technology to make concrete was apparently lost in the war, so every road is made out of cobblestones. So you talk to everyone in the village and find that the wizard, Zebu, has left some money lying around for you. Also, this guy gives you a sword, specifically the Wind Sword, which is one of the 4 magic swords that the wizards hid. I don't know how this guy got it, but it's very convenient. Now while you're in town, you might as well buy some crappy armor. Alright, as you can guess, we are going to go out and slay some monsters. Though actually the monsters are kind of scarce around these parts. Crystalis is an action RPG, similar to Legend of Zelda, though I guess it feels more like Ys than anything else, except of course that Ys is a lot of fun, and Crystalis is not so fun? We'll see. Zebu, one of the 4 wizard guys, is hanging out in this cave. Zebu will teach you magic spells, but only if you perform some chores for him. The guy's all, "Sorry dude, I know you're the only one who can save the world, but first of all you gotta go fix the windmill. Also, you should be grinding for experience, walking around and killing some slimes and tigermen, which are worth 1 and 2 experience points respectively. Yeah, so basically there's going to be a lot of grinding in this game. Gaining levels increases your life bar and your magic bar, and you also have strength and defense stats. And while leveling up doesn't directly give you any new abilities, you will need to be at certain levels to enter some areas or perform some actions. So even if you are really good at the game, you can't beat the game at a low level. You pretty much have to level up all the way. So the windmill is pretty far away from town, and you have to go through a cave to get there. You'll find a sleeping dude. How do you wake him up? Well, the manual says the alarm flute will wake him up. Luckily, the alarm flute is sold in the town's item shop for 50 bucks. This will more than likely pretty much take up all your money. There's a lot of flutes in this game, though if we take a look at them, you'll notice that they are technically ocarinas. So you wake up this dude, he gives you the key to start the windmill, and hints at a strange ball hidden in the caves. As a reward, Zebu teaches you the heal spell, which the game calls Refresh. You can then enter the first real dungeon of the game. I do kind of like some stuff here, like this part where you can walk under bridges. It's a rather clever graphical trick. One of Crystalis' main fighting mechanics is charging up your sword. Holding down the B button will allow you to unleash a powerful ranged attack, which is helpful because you can kill monsters from a distance. Once you pick up the aforementioned ball for the wind sword, you can now charge your sword up to 2 levels, which unleashes a blast powerful enough to break through certain walls. And by the way, you have to be all the way pressed up against the wall for this to work, something that isn't obvious when playing this for the first time. And this is one of the main mechanics, charging up your weapons and breaking walls. Leveling up your sword allows you to kill stronger monsters and to break through walls and enter new areas. So your goal here is to make your way to the first boss, a vampire, then of course defeat him and obtain the rabbit boots. These will allow you to jump when equipped. You see, certain areas are blocked by toxic swamps, which damage you when you walk across them. Jumping through them reduces the damage you take, so you can get to the other side of the lake alive. There are 10 different areas in this game, with each being usually connected by a small passage near either the top or bottom of the map. This area right here is number 2, Cordell Plain. There's a lot of irritating things about Crystalis, and we encounter one of those things here. Some enemies cannot be harmed by certain swords. The wind sword has no effect on mushrooms. And sure, a lot of RPGs have something similar to this, but in Crystalis it gets really tiresome, especially as you get further into the game. Also, the game is structured so that you are frequently running into dead ends until you just happen to find some particular item or person, or perform some action in order to move forward, like this swampy area. The air is poisoned, so after you've obtained the rabbit boots, you'll need to then get the gas mask in order to survive this part. There's a town here, but it doesn't provide any clues as to what to do next. You can talk to everyone, but they don't really say anything of interest. So you keep wandering around until you run into another wizard, Tornell, and he makes you fight this dude. And then he says to look for the tornado bracelet and gives you the power of telepathy, which according to the manual allows you to talk to animals, or communicate with wise men and sometimes hear hints about the story. It sounds handy, but you can't really use it too much yet since you don't have very many magic points. But still, there's no clues as to where to go next. Turns out you have to go back to the swamp village, use telepathy on the townspeople, which will then unlock a dialogue option with a lady whose kid is missing. Naturally, you go to find the kid, bring him back. His mom gives you the insect flute, which, as per the manual, will summon a giant insect if you play it in the right place. Where is this place? I don't know. I guess just keep trying until you find it. Once you find the right spot and you kill the giant beetle, he will drop the ball of fire, which will power up the Sword of Flame 1 level. Why would a giant beetle have the Firestone? Again, I have no idea. Now, having quest items and such is not new in video games, but compared to something like Legend of Zelda, there are an awful lot of these damn things, and a lot of them are not really necessarily clear as to what they're used for. Like the X-ray goggles are used just once in the game, I believe, when you have to walk into some random house and use them to look for a hidden entrance. Crystalis certainly feels like it just makes you run all over the damn place looking for random statues, flutes, and lamps. And it sort of uses this as a way to stretch out the game time, it feels like. Also, the environments feel a bit samey. Most of the dungeons look very similar. Long corridors which occasionally have a 90-degree turn or a 3-way intersection. It's easy to get lost simply because every corridor looks virtually the same. With a few exceptions, the pattern is basically visit a village, maybe enter a little cave or a house out in the overworld and talk to some guy, then enter a dungeon, blast through some blocked walls with your power-up sword, and eventually make it to the boss, and then go on and do the same thing in all 10 of the game's areas. And this might not be fair to compare this to a Super Nintendo game, but if we look at this next to, for example, Soul Blazer, it feels very repetitive and a little dull. And remember, Soul Blazer came out only a year and a half after Crystalis. Anyway, in this mountain level, we seem to have learned that Dragonia is not just a person, but there's some sort of Dragonian empire who's imprisoning people, and you'll encounter Dragonian soldiers more frequently in the game going forward, though they don't appear to be any smarter than regular monsters. The boss of this level is General Kebelesk. He seems to be like an earth elemental. He throws rocks at you. There are 4 evil wizards in addition to the 4 good wizards, and that's what geniuses like me call parallelism. Defeating him gives you the Flame Bracelet, which is what lets you power up your Sword of Fire all the way. Then you enter Waterfall Valley, which looks a lot like the first 2 areas, and in the first town you have to deal with a lot of funny business from the Queen, so you can go in and talk to her, but she's not very interesting. There's also a fortune teller in town who tells you to talk to the Queen. However, because the guards won't let you into her room, you now need to go to Mount Saber and find yourself a paralysis spell, which you will then need to come back to town, use on the guard who's guarding the queen, so he won't walk in front of the door and block you. But the queen is gone, and there's a cave with an underground river behind the throne room. And here's an example of the game's logic really bugging me. I mean, you have rabbit boots, which allow you to jump, and in the last level you use the boots to get past these ice slides. And so naturally I figure I'm going to use the boots to cross this narrow part of the river, right? The way the river gets like conspicuously narrow right here, I mean, this must be a crossing point. Well, it turns out it's not. Now, if you go talk to the fortune teller again, she'll say, once again, go talk to the queen, who now has returned and mentions a cave. But the cave she's talking about is not the cave behind her room, it's the cave behind a waterfall. And this whole section is totally ridiculous, as it mostly just involves you entering and exiting the castle multiple times. So of course you head on out to the waterfall cave, and in this cave you find some people turned to stone, and there's also Medusas who will turn you into stone. However, here you do finally find sword number 3, the Sword of Water. Now to do this you have to go through all these steps. I mean, you can't directly go into the waterfall cave, because these guys are turned to stone and will block your path if you didn't obtain the magic flute, or rather the magic ocarina, I guess, that the queen gives you. The whole thing feels like you need to be either using a walkthrough or just be a kid who's going to play this thing for like months trying to figure out how to beat the game. And that's kind of the problem with this sort of game. As an adult, you just don't have the patience for this kind of nonsense. And yeah, this is pretty typical of quite a lot of old NES games. I mean, they don't all hold up the same way that like Super Mario 3 or Super Metroid or Symphony of the Night does. Crystalis is just so formulaic and just doesn't have enough good parts, I guess, to make it worth your time, in my opinion. So after running into this guy, Rage, protector of the lime tree, you get the power up for the water sword, which is very useful. And also someone named Messia appears and then vanishes. Alright, so the water sword can now freeze small streams of water. So if you go back to the cave behind the queen's chamber, you can now cross this stream and discover that the queen and the fortune teller are actually the same person. Whoa, I did not see that one coming. Wow. Anyway, she'll teach you magic spells if you run some errands for her first. On the way out, you need to give a healing item to a dolphin who will help you out later. Then you need to go to another cave and find some herb, and there's a town full of man-hating ladies, and you have to borrow this guy's boat so you can sail out and fix the ocean. The ocean is angry. And of course, all of this means more dungeons. There's always more dungeons in this game. For me, Crystalis started getting really annoying around this point, and we're not even halfway through the game yet. Around this time, it seems like every other monster can inflict status elements on you, like poison, paralysis, curse, or even just turn you into stone. Luckily by now you have the recovery spell, but that does use up magic, and unlike in some JRPGs, you can't just stock up on tons of potions to restore magic points. I should probably also mention the really weird menus and controls. Now, the D-pad of course controls your character, while the B button attacks with your weapon, and A typically casts whatever magic spell you have equipped. And this makes sense, right? B is your fire button, A is your secondary button, typically to jump in action games. I mean, that's how it works in Power Blade or Mega Man or whatever. And when you have like a menu, usually B is to select and A is to go back, exit, etc. So in Crystalis, in the equipment menu, when your cursor is on a weapon or an item, pressing B does not select the item, it drops the item. A selects the item. And I swear the whole time I was playing this game, I always mixed up the two buttons. Also, I intuitively felt the start button should return you back to the game when it actually takes you to a screen where it shows you what items the buttons are assigned to. And my getting all these buttons mixed up is not just me. I did see videos of people playing Crystalis and they were always doing the exact same thing. And speaking of which, despite only having 2 action buttons, you can have more than 2 usable items equipped at the same time. So aside from a sword and magic, you can also at the same time equip a quest item like a flute, or special one-use items like medicinal herbs, or the rabbit shoes. And you can have like 4 usable items equipped at once, but you only have 2 buttons. So there were times when I equipped an item, assumed it was mapped to the A button, but then when I pressed the A button it actually cast a magic spell instead. I never really mastered the art of the equipment screens. Alright, so anyway, you just keep plugging along. There's another mountain level, but this time it's a hot mountain instead of a cold mountain. Eventually you'll find the last of the 4 magic swords, the lightning sword, which has the most powerful attack. You will also venture into Dragonian territory and are about to enter this Dragonian palace, or whatever, when the town where all the good guys hang out gets attacked. And you must then fight Matto, a ninja-style dude who can turn into a ball like Sonic and fly around really fast. And at this point, I was like psychologically done with Crystalis. The last few areas in particular are just an endless series of giant maze-like dungeons, made all the more annoying by the fact that virtually every enemy is immune to damage from 2 or 3 elements, which means you'll need to switch swords to kill them. And unless you've memorized the property of every single enemy in this game, you will need to switch weapons often 1 or 2 times before finding the right sword. And I'll say this particular issue is the thing that virtually kills Crystalis. By Area 3, you'll be encountering this constantly. A group of enemies come at you, you hit them, and nothing happened. Or rather, you hit them and they make like a little ching noise, like you're hitting a wall of metal or something. So you pause the game, switch swords, and attack them. And if you want to use your powered up attack, you'll also need to switch the ball or bracelet as well. And when you come across a destructible wall, you'll need to switch weapons again, because each type of destructible wall can only be damaged by one particular weapon. So let's just say that your select button is going to get a serious workout if you're playing this game. While there's never been a sequel made to this, Crystalis did get ported to the Game Boy Color in 2000. The intro is certainly more engaging, and the story is more clear, and overall the translation is better. And while, generally speaking, the Game Boy Color version is considered to be inferior to the NES version, the one big change they made was they completely ditched the elemental immunity for the monsters. Obviously, even SNK realized how awful this was. Alright, so the penultimate dungeon is a 4-story dungeon with a boss on each level. And these are actually bosses you've all fought before, just now they're somewhat powered up. First one is General Kabalesk, who seems to move faster than he used to and shoots these green fireballs. And these, I guess, are probably the toughest fights in the game, but thankfully one of the good wizards is always going to be in the next room after each battle, so they can refill your health and magic, because without that, I mean, you would never get through all 4 bosses. Alright, so Sabera is next, who shoots out these room-filling projectiles at you. The worst is almost certainly Motto, who can still roll himself up into a ball, but now he is just super fast and just like flies across the room like a pinball. It is so annoying. And the last one is Carmine, who once again throws projectiles everywhere and moves around pretty quickly. And what makes these fights so tough is the way the boss's projectiles will like fence you in and limit your motion, at the same time the boss himself is bearing down on you like a locomotive. All of these bosses seem to move pretty quickly, more quickly than you. Now you do get an important power-up at the end of this area, the Flight spell. Flight might be a bit inaccurate, it's more of a hover spell, but it does allow you to get into previously inaccessible spots. And yes, as a matter of fact, you will have to backtrack to earlier areas of the game in order to get important quest items. So late in the game you get something called Deo's Pendant, which is very useful as it refills your MP whenever you're standing still. Also, you will find the best armor and shields, the Psycho Armor and the Psycho Shield. The Psycho Armor will slowly refill your health, so between that and Deo's Pendant, you can keep your health and magic topped up before boss fights. However, the name refers back to SNK's 1987 arcade game Psycho Soldier, in which you control two psychic teens, Athena Asamiya and Shi Kenzu, and together they, kill a lot of bad guys. I'm not really sure what this game is about. And of course, the name Athena refers back to SNK's earlier game, Athena. And both of these characters, Athena and Shi Kenzu, appear in Crystalis as two of the good wizards. Nowadays, however, they're mostly known as characters in SNK's long-running King of the Fighters series. Alright, so it turns out that despite nuclear war destroying every building on the planet, the Great Pyramid is actually still standing and relatively unscathed. In fact, it seems to have been nicely renovated once you enter it. Here you will fight the big boss, Emperor Dragon, who is relatively easy compared to some of the earlier bosses. Now, I've run down a number of reasons why I don't like this game, and I'll point out one last thing. It's really damn long. Looking at video playthroughs online, it seemed like this was going to be around a 3-hour game, but in reality it felt more like 30 hours. And one review that I read estimated it as being around 25 hours, so it's pretty damn long for an NES adventure game, and substantially longer than Soul Blazer or Ys Books 1 and 2. 3 hours is practically a speed run, where you know the exact most efficient path through the game and you never get lost in dungeons and never accidentally fall into one of the many pits that litter the dungeons. As for myself, I spent a substantial amount of time walking through the many identical looking dungeon passageways and getting completely lost. Now, I apologize for making this segment so long, but Crystalis caused me a great deal of misery, and I wanted to make sure that you guys suffered a bit too. Anyway, you have to enter the back door for the Great Pyramid in order to get to the pyramid's basement. And, oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. You need to have collected 2 special bows to get past this wall. And I feel bad for anyone who got to this point but didn't get both bows, which is quite possible because you actually have to go back to an earlier level to get the Bow of the Sun once you've obtained the ability to fly. Okay, so now you fight Dragon again in his final form. A dragon, well, that's a surprise. I mean, the guy is named Dragon. But you know, this guy isn't actually very tough. You just use your level 3 lightning attack a few times. And the thing about these battles is that your magic only charges when you're standing still. So you need to keep holding down the charge button while moving around and dodging its attacks, occasionally stopping when it's safe so that you can continue charging your attack till it gets all the way up to level 3. But even then, it's still not over. Remember the floating tower from the intro and that powerful computer mentioned in the manual? Well, your next step is to teleport to that floating tower and blow up the computer. Still confused as to whether the computer is good or evil. Now at this point I was having problems which were probably caused by using a cheat code to increase my experience points, so I could get to a high enough level to beat the game without killing dozens and dozens of additional monsters. This somehow caused my money to hit like the maximum amount of money possible, which I assume messed up something else in the game because I could not do any damage to these enemies, and you have to kill every single enemy on each floor in order to unlock the entrance to the next floor. So I was forced to use an insta-kill cheat in order to reach the top floor. Normally though, these guys are actually super tough and take like a dozen hits to kill, each single one. And then your 4 swords merge together into the more powerful Crystalis sword. The computer then goes all Danmaku at you, and you shoot him with your charged up sword a few times. The weird thing about Crystalis is that in theory I like stuff like this, but just everything felt off somehow. It felt too long, too repetitive, too many items to collect. Giving the sword's elemental properties sounds kinda cool, but it ends up feeling like a chore more than anything else. Most of it might just be the way that so many dungeons are like so hard to navigate because they all look the same. Dragon Quest IV was a game with tons of dungeons, but they threw in some very creative ideas for their dungeon designs, like the giant bronze statue, or that big tree that's in like the elf village. Even a lot of parts of the overworld in this game look very samey. Maybe a world map would have been a good idea, or a map in the manual. I feel like I spent a lot of time just kind of wandering around looking for something but not really knowing what. I mean, there are worse games in this episode, but none of them drove me just batshit insane like Crystalis did. We're going to close this episode out with another big one here, 2 games for the price of 1. We're talking about Power Blazer, released in Japan on April 20th, 1990, which is appropriate because they must have been high as all hell when they made this game. And the second game here is Power Blade, the heavily reworked version of Power Blazer released outside of Japan. This hit US shelves around March 1991. I'm sure that most people watching this will be considerably more familiar with Power Blade than the original Japanese game, so at great personal cost to my own sanity, I have played all the way through Power Blazer, and boy, I do not like this game. Power Blazer appears to be Taito's attempt to create a Mega Man style game. We have a very similar stage select screen that allows you to choose any stage except for the final level. The levels themselves are similar in style to Mega Man, with lots of jumping and climbing ladders. Each level has you traveling from screen to screen both horizontally and vertically. And your character looks a little bit like Mega Man, obviously. Yet, absolutely everything that made Mega Man so great is missing here. For example, good controls. Very tight controls are necessary to make Mega Man playable. Power Blazer's controls are extremely finicky, especially the jumping. A number of the jumps you have to make have about 1 pixel's worth of leeway. You have to be right on the very edge of the platform to guarantee you'll make it. And part of this could be because I'm playing on an emulator and there might be a slight delay, but I recorded Mega Man 1 and 2 on an emulator and did not have these problems. I feel like I've missed more jumps in Power Blazer than any other NES game I've played. Also, there's the ladders. You must be positioned exactly in the right spot to climb a ladder. If you're not precisely in the middle of the ladder, you'll fail to grab the ladder and just fall back down again. Needless to say, both of these annoyances with both the jumping and climbing ladders were fixed for the US version. So here's the worst part of this level. If you fall on this part, you'll land on a series of platforms with spikes between them. Going to the right will get you another life, going to the left will allow you to get back up, but this section just goes on and on, like literally platform after platform. It's so tiresome. And there are a lot of genuinely unfair deaths in this. Check out these jet flames. Did you see that? The flame didn't come anywhere near me. Typically, you would expect to have time to get out of the way before the flame actually touches you, but in Power Blazer, when the very first frame of the fire appears, you will die. And all of this nonsense is just on this one level. Oh yes, and also it throws an annoying bit where we need to jump on moving and vanishing blocks right before the door to the boss's room. This boss isn't too bad by itself, you just need to avoid his lightning bolts and watch out for him when he swoops down very quickly at you. This guy is fast, and if it's not clear what's going on here, you need to throw your boomerang so that he runs into it while he's diving. You will then head back to the level select screen. You can do these levels in any order, but this screen doesn't show you which levels you've already completed, which is just yet another of the many annoyances in this game. This next level here starts with windmills, and of course a series of platforms suspended over a floor lined with spikes. This game absolutely loves its spikes. I should point out your boomerang weapon. It's incredibly weak and needs to recharge for a second or two after you throw it. It's virtually useless against stronger enemies. It also has very little range initially, but throughout the game, enemies will drop little power-ups that will gradually improve its range. Now you might be wondering, does this game have any Mega Man style special weapons? And the answer is no. The boomerang is it. That is what you use for the entire game. Power Blazer is pretty nice looking in places. This area here has like a Castlevania clock tower vibe, but regardless of how cool it looks sometimes, I could never really stop hating this game for more than a second. Now, Taito decided to make some changes to this game for the US version. In fact, they practically rebuilt the game from scratch. Obviously, the character has been completely redesigned, and we now have an opening cutscene which explains the plot. Now, unlike in Power Blazer, you can't just waltz into the boss rooms. You need to find security cards from your contacts in each level. This seems pretty similar to Capcom's Codename Viper from a few episodes ago, though Power Blade is a much better game than Codename Viper. The level select screen has been redesigned, and it very nicely shows you which areas you've already completed, unlike Power Blazer. Upon starting up Power Blade, you will notice that you feel much faster and more powerful. You can easily clear most jumps. While the levels in Power Blazer are relatively short and mostly linear, in Power Blade each level has been redesigned so that you need to do some exploration. So this level, level 1, the Space Shuttle level, is the equivalent of the far right level in Power Blazer. As you can see, if we compare the two, the backgrounds have all been completely altered, enemies have been changed, it's virtually a completely different game. You also get power-ups much more quickly in Power Blade. Your boomerang will become powerful enough to take out large enemies in a few hits. You'll be able to shoot multiple boomerangs at once. And best of all is the metal suit or power suit. The manual refers to it by both names. It turns you into a total killing machine. You lose this suit after taking 3 hits from enemies. While the bosses are mostly the same, the boss fights are going to be much trickier in Power Blazer. This guy can be a bit tough because he's hard to hit in the air, but sometimes you can get your boomerang to hit his backside multiple times. On the other hand, in Power Blade, this guy goes down incredibly fast. Newly added to Power Blade are these little scenes where you disarm the computer, complete with a celebratory fist pump. Power Blade's level 2 borrows a few things from the first level that we played of Power Blazer, like all this scaffolding. Both levels have these faces that vomit up bubbles at you, as well as a clock tower-like series of rooms full of gears and platforms, as well as lots of jets of flame to avoid. There's also a water theme here for a bit. Perhaps this is some kind of hydroelectric plant? This level's boss is a red dragon. He rolls into a ball and charges you. In Power Blazer, you'll need to perform a lot of carefully timed jumps as he charges you. In Power Blade, you barely have to bother. Section 3 is an underground level with various computer rooms and subterranean lakes. It's very similar to its Power Blazer equivalent in terms of graphics, though in Power Blazer, in addition to all the regular enemies, there are blobs of green slime that drip from the ceiling and can harm you. Now, as I've mentioned, all the boss fights in Power Blazer are harder, but this one is incredibly annoying because it's so damn long. You need to destroy the 4 cells in the hive that have like the solid yellow-orange color. These 4 cells constantly spit out bees at you. You just keep killing them and eventually a cell will be empty. In Power Blade, this is no problem. With your multiple boomerangs, you're a bee-killing fool. This boss fight took around 30 seconds for me. But in Power Blazer, man, there are a lot of bees you need to kill. It just goes on and on. There's a video playthrough online of Power Blazer by some guy who's really good at it, and this fight took him almost 5 minutes. That's 10 times as long as it took me to kill the boss in Power Blade. And this particular guy finished the entire game in 28 minutes. So this one boss fight accounted for almost 1/5 of the entire playtime. This particular part, as well as the final boss fight, is just stupidly drawn out, and shows how poorly designed some parts of Power Blazer actually are. Level 4 is the equivalent to the first level we played of Power Blazer, and comparing the two you can see how Blade's version is more focused on fast-paced combat rather than hideous platforming. We also get a cold section in the Power Blade version. There's no equivalent to this in Power Blazer. By the way, I mentioned you need to find a contact in each level, who gives you this ID card to open the door to the boss room. You then typically need to backtrack a bit and find the path to the end of the level. I wouldn't call Power Blade a Metroidvania or anything like that, but it does feel more exploratory than Blazer. Again, this boss is almost trivial in Power Blade. You can simply attack him directly while he's in the air, rather than forcing him to run down into your boomerang as he dives at you. And that's one criticism that can be leveled at Power Blade. It's almost too easy. Much of the difficulty of Power Blazer is due to only being able to shoot directly in front of you. Giving you a much more powerful weapon that can fly further and can be fired upwards or diagonally just completely changes the game. Now don't get me wrong, Power Blade is a vastly superior game. I absolutely hated playing through Power Blazer. It's just full of balance issues and cheap deaths. In level 5, you hop onto the ship and make your way through the ship's hull. Power Blade does add a few enemies that provide some complications, like these little mobile bombs that fall from the ceiling and come running really fast. The equivalent stage in Power Blazer is very different. It begins in a very different fashion as you jump through a long procession of jeeps and tanks. Now this appears to be sort of like the unofficial first level of Power Blazer. The levels aren't numbered like they are in Power Blade, but when the level select screen first loads up when you start a new game, you are positioned on this level by default. If this was in fact intended as the first level to play, this is a pretty weird way to start a game, because this level is just obnoxious as all hell. Another of the many gripes I have about Power Blazer, there's no indication when bosses take damage. They don't blink or anything when hit, so it's not obvious that you're using the correct technique to defeat the boss. In Power Blade, the bosses have a visible health meter, but in Blazer, you're not really sure if you're actually hitting their weak spot or not until they finally die. Area 6 in Power Blade is sort of a strange sewer underground level. It feels a little shorter and more straightforward than some of the other levels. Meanwhile, the Power Blazer version is New York City. Eventually you'll enter some sewers and then fight Frankenstein. Perhaps the Frankenstein monster was a bit too goofy because they swapped out Frank for this giant robot, who's actually a little bit tougher when you have the metal armor because he's harder to hit. With the boomerangs, you can just hit him right in the head. Once you've beaten all 6 sectors, you can move on to the Master Computer area. The actual plot here is that alien terrorists have disrupted the Master Computer, and you've got to reboot it. I think all the enemies in the game are supposed to be like malfunctioning security robots and stuff like that. It doesn't look like you're actually fighting any actual aliens. The Master Computer wishes you luck, how nice of him, and this level is sort of a generic computer-based design. However, in Power Blazer, this starts you off like you're in the Castlevania hallway. Also, I'll point out while that Power Blazer does lack the cool multiple boomerang power-up or the metal armor, your wimpy little weapon will eventually be able to go through enemies and damage multiple enemies at once. The boomerang will be red when powered up, but enemies will sometimes drop a power-up shaped like the letter N, which actually powers down the boomerang to regular form. And it's quite easy to catch an N power-up by accident when killing an enemy that's really close to you. And also, I can't recall seeing this happen in any other games, but enemy drops in Power Blazer, like health and power-ups, can get stuck in a wall or a ceiling where you can't grab them. This actually happens a lot in the game. Oh yeah, and one last total asshole move before the final boss. There are surprise falling platforms. So the final boss is sort of a two-part boss. First up is his floating head. He's not that bad, you just need to move out from underneath him to get out of his way of his projectiles, then jump up and shoot him. He's not really tough, but once again, Power Blazer gives you no indication that you're actually doing damage to him. I had to use a health refill here. Both Blazer and Blade have these refills that you can stock up on and then use when necessary. After defeating him, the second final boss appears, and it's a bubble machine? You need to shoot the exposed core while jumping over the bubbles. Just like the beehive boss, this one goes on way too long, about 2 minutes of constantly shooting at it. As a reward, you get this little scene here where you get to look out over the city. Power Blade, on the other hand, dispenses with the falling blocks, but the first boss is exactly the same as Power Blazer's. Luckily, the bubble machine is replaced by this floating CPU thing, and you need to shoot its exposed core while dodging fireballs that are falling from the ceiling. If you're feeling really bold, you can stand right below it and just unload your weapon into its guts. No, thank you, Nova. Now, one thing Power Blade didn't improve on was Power Blazer's very silly credit sequence. Honestly, it was pretty cool of Taito to take an almost unplayable game like Power Blazer and polish it into a really fun game like Power Blade. And yeah, maybe your weapon is just a little too overpowered, especially with the metal armor, but I can't complain too much. I mean, not every NES game has to be Ninja Gaiden. There is a harder difficulty setting which gives you a shorter timer, and enemies knock you backwards when they hit you, so if you've mastered the regular mode and want a bit more of a challenge, you can play that. So regardless of any reservations about Power Blade, it is still a pretty radical action platformer from Taito. finally, our last game this episode. The appearance of the loathsome domino mask logo lets us know that we're going to be looking at a game from Banpresto, the Japanese toy and video game company. They were previously known as Corland, until Bandai purchased an interest in the company, and it was renamed Banpresto. This is their first Famicom game. As the name SD Battle Oozumou suggests, this game combines two of Japan's cultural traditions, sumo wrestling and grotesquely short versions of licensed characters. So if you like TV show robots, this game provides a dazzling array of intellectual properties from various companies. You've got your Ultramans, your Gundams, I think, your Kamen Riders, who are dudes who ride motorcycles but dress like bugs for some reason. There's also this superhero dude who looks like he's a Banpresto mascot. I guess I'll go with one of the bug guys. Now, in terms of wrestling or sumo games, this is pretty basic. You have a very limited number of moves, like 5 or so. You can shove your opponent, you can lift him up, you can throw him a little bit. Your character has some sort of health bar, which gets depleted if you get hit. When it gets low, like about 4 bars or so, you can get knocked out of the ring. Now, once you get the hang of it, taking out your opponents is pretty simple. Just keep slapping them and pushing them, wearing down their health until you can knock them out of the ring. This is very much literally a button mashing game. And unlike most wrestling games we've seen, characters do not have any individual stats or any kind of special moves. So your opponents don't get any more difficult as the game progresses. So if you play the single player mode, you can technically beat the game, just like in most fighting games. The various venues change as you make progress throughout the game. However, you might be wondering just how long is the actual single player game. I looked up a long play video that beat the game for one character in a little over 30 minutes. Each match is around a minute at the very most, which would add up to quite a few matches. So on the surface, this looks like a completely unmemorable game. But sometimes when we start digging a little deeper, we uncover dark secrets. Soon we realize that what we're looking at is just the tip of the iceberg. And what lies below the surface can drive a man to madness. SD Battle Oozumou unleashed a veritable orgy of kosogi that would last for decades, a series known as the hi-rez. This game had its origins in a toy manufacturer named Poppy, one of the first companies known for producing high-quality toys based on sci-fi cartoons and TV shows. Poppy obtained the licenses to make toys based on Mazinger Z, Kamen Rider, and various other properties. Poppy went under for various reasons and was absorbed into Bandai, who of course already had merchandising rights for Ultraman and other similar products, so I guess someone decided why not just cram all this stuff together into one crossover game. SD Battle Oozumou is a pretty unambitious start to the series. But Banpresto would follow it up with the second game a mere 2.5 months later, and then keep pumping these things out non-stop over the next 30 years. In fact, the most recent game, Super Robot Wars 30, will be released around the same time as this episode comes out. The sheer number of these things that they made is overwhelming. There's multiple sub-series that exist inside the main series. For example, the Great Battle series, which premiered in 1991. Or Super Robot Wars, a tactical RPG series, which is probably going to be the most familiar name among Westerners, and definitely the most active branch of hi-rez at the moment. So if tactical RPGs is not your bag, there's all kinds of stuff like good old-fashioned dungeon crawler RPGs, such as the Lost Souls game. If you're more into sports games, then there are baseball games, soccer games, and yes, even dodgeball games. Heck, they even made a pinball game about giant robots fighting each other. And of course, there are pachinko games. And as you can imagine, they also made Compati Heroes manga and anime products. Virtually every console since 1990 received one of these games, even the Sega Pico. I don't know how many Compati Heroes games there are, but I mean it's well over 40. Basically it's like the Mario Brothers series, except that it's crap. Anyway, I think I've had enough of awful games for today, so let's wrap this up. Alright, assuming anyone is still awake or just hasn't died of old age, let's pick the best and worst games this episode. Best is a pretty easy choice. Power Blade. Not Power Blazer, of course, but Power Blade. It's not the most challenging NES game, but after Ninja Gaiden 2, it just feels like a breath of fresh air. Worst game? I mean, Crystalis is certainly the game that tormented me the most. It was like a bad steak, you know, the more of it you eat, the bigger it gets. But I'm gonna have to hand the award to SD Battle Oozumou. Not only is it a terrible game, but it begat the entire Compati Heroes series. It's basically patient zero for a whole epidemic of Kosogi games. Next month we'll have some really big games, but to avoid the same bottleneck we saw this episode, I am taking the unprecedented step to push back one game. Snake's Revenge will actually be covered in episode 61, and I can justify this because Snake's Revenge is a US game which doesn't have an actual release date. Yeah, Nintendo officially says April 1990s, but who knows, maybe it came out in March, maybe in May. Anyway, thanks to all the patrons and everyone else for your patience during these difficult times, and I'll see you next episode.